On this episode of Hot Rod Hoarders, we rescue a one-of-a-kind sports car body out of a scrapyard in Kentucky, and we make the most of our road trip by also buying a front-engine dragster to add to our collection. So if you've watched some of my other videos, you may remember a video about Tony McConnell's collection of old drag cars. And you may also remember a video about the NHRA Street Rod Nationals in Louisville, Kentucky. Well, I killed 2 or 3 birds with one stone on that trip because I covered a lot of different things. One of those things was sort of an investigation of an old sports car body that was sitting in a scrapyard. And I'd heard about this car from a friend on Facebook, and I just had to go see this thing because it happened to be a Kellison. And this is a really rare sports car that was sort of a kit car back in the 50s and 60s. And they were based on Corvette frames, but they had a really distinct fiberglass body. And these were really popular platforms for drag cars. Of course, I love old drag cars. I realized that this was a recognizable car and this thing had some history. So of course, I wanted to buy it and I wanted to be able to rescue it out of this scrapyard. I wanted to be able to preserve it the best I can. And obviously, I want to be able to document its history and bring that all to you guys here. And I also made it a point to strike up another deal on another historic drag car in the Louisville, Kentucky area. So I wanted to make an efficient trip, pick up 2 cars with 1 truck and trailer load, and this was the best way to do it. Now, our crew for this trip included my dad, of course, and then 2 of our good friends, Tommy Dillard and Denny George. Now, in a previous video, you may remember the Denny George collection. He's been fooling with cars for 50 plus years, and Tommy Dillard has been too. He's been a drag racer and a hot rodder for lots and lots and lots of years. I mean, these are just people that I've grown up around. So it was a really fun trip up to Louisville, and we had a great time. Even though it was hot, even though it was a lot of work, it was actually much more work than we imagined, and you'll see that here in this video. But just absolutely a good time with some good people. So our first stop on the trip was Tony McConnell's place. The plan was to get this front engine dragster up on the trailer and get it fastened down, and then we were going to set that fiberglass body right over the top of it. It sounded simple enough. It sounded like it would just fit right over there. And you'll see on this car, it's got about a 100-inch wheelbase. And based on the rear design and based on the frame rails and all that kind of stuff, we're guessing this is probably a late 50s style dragster. It's kind of hard to tell sometimes because this particular car has been changed. It's got torsion bar front suspension and sort of like an aftermarket tube axle instead of an old school I-beam axle. So, you know, some changes have been made, but our best guess is late 50s. I'm going to be researching this car and trying to find some history on it. Somewhere down the road, I'll do a video showing the history on this car because I'm sure I'll be able to find something on it. But for now, the idea was to get it home, and this was part of the process, was getting it loaded up on the trailer. Luckily, it didn't weigh very much. We were actually able to just pick it up and stick it on the trailer. You know, this car has some pretty cool little pieces. It's got a Crosley steering box. It's got Kreitz front wheels. You know, the rest of it is kind of just homemade stuff, but it does have a cut-down, big old rear end in it. Just lots of cool little historic pieces on this car that should be able to help us identify it as I'm looking through the photo archives and the video archives to try to pinpoint some of those details. So once we got the deal squared away on that chassis, we headed across town to the scrapyard where this old school fiberglass body was sitting. And according to the guy that I worked with on the deal, this thing had been sitting there for 30 plus years. And it had been abused. You know, it was a race car to begin with. So, you know, a lot of times those cars didn't live very precious lives. They kind of got beat up. You know, this thing sitting in a scrapyard didn't do it any favors. It sat out in the sun, which baked all the paint off of it other than just a little bit. Luckily, that paint is still there. A couple of spots of lettering is still visible, which is going to help us document this car. But the fiberglass is busted up, and I would say that a lot of this damage has happened right here in the scrapyard. If somebody had got their hands on this car 30-something years ago, it was probably still pretty usable. As of right now, we're just buying this as a conversation piece. We're buying it just so that we can rescue it out of the scrapyard and put it in front of people so that they can see it again. So the real challenge was going to be getting this thing out of this spot. There was like 100 hoods laying up against it. There were appliances, there was a box truck, a trailer. There were parts and pieces scattered all around this thing. It was going to be a huge challenge to get it out. And again, it was extremely hot. We're talking, mid to upper 90s, big time humidity. It was not the conditions that we wanted as far as dragging this thing out of there. But we had to figure out a way to do it. We were there. We had made the 5-hour trip. We were going to get it home no matter what. So we came up with a plan, but it was going to require some help. So we recruited a few guys, and we carried this thing out backwards. Instead of moving all that junk that was in front of it, we picked it up, tilted it up on its side, and fished it out between 2 or 3 other cars so that we could get it out into the open and then make our way out of the scrapyard. Luckily, this is a fiberglass body, so it wasn't quite as heavy as, let's say, a steel body, but it's still a pretty awkward piece to carry because this thing was just about to fall apart in our hands. So we had to be really cautious about how we handled this thing just to try to preserve it, try to make the most of this piece of an old drag car. So we carried it out of there. Luckily, we had lots of help. We carried it out. We got it over to the trailer, and suddenly we realized that we couldn't put this thing onto that chassis the way that we thought. The aluminum interior panels on this body was preventing us from just sitting the body over that frame. So we had to back up and punt. We had to take the body back off. We turned it around backwards thinking that would help, and only had more issues. So we had to take it back off again, take the rear wheels and tires off of the dragster chassis, set it down low, then put the body back on again for a third time, and then get everything strapped down to try to make it as secure as possible without doing any damage to that fragile fiberglass that had been sitting out in the sun for 30-something years. So we had to be creative on how we strapped it down, but we were successful. We got back in the truck and we were all exhausted, and I'm telling you one thing, them old dudes, my dad and Tommy Dillard and Denny George, they're tough because I was absolutely exhausted. I was dehydrated. I had a major headache. I was absolutely miserable on that 5-hour ride home. But just the experience of going and digging these things out, it was just a pretty big day for us. So we're glad to have this stuff back home. It now gives me the opportunity to research these cars, figure out the history, and of course, before I even got this Kellison home, I kind of already have some ideas of where this thing might have come from. I've got some good leads, I've got some good information, and I'm going to be able to put together a really cool piece on the history of this car. So stay tuned for that. And meanwhile, I'm going to continue trying to dig up some history on this old dragster. It's got some pretty peculiar details on it that'll help me identify it. And let's just hope that I can find the right picture that really tells the story of this car. So continue watching, continue following along with our progress, and stay tuned every week for a new video. You never know what you'll run across on my channel. We cover hot rods, drag cars, big car collections, all sorts of cool stuff. So stay tuned.